Hey everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Informative Ada. I am so incredibly glad you've joined us for today's explainer. We're going to sit down, get comfortable, and really unpack the fascinating science behind a completely universal human frustration. You know the one. You set a goal, you fully 100% mean to achieve it, and then you just fail to follow through. Honestly, whether it's eating healthier, finally exercising more, or just decluttering the house, we have all been there. So today, we're going to look at the psychological anatomy of a goal and break down exactly why this happens, and more importantly, how we can actually outsmart our own biology.
So let's kick things off with a highly relatable question. Why is motivation never enough? You see, people often fail to act on their best intentions. Researchers actually have a name for this. They call it the intention-action gap. And what's truly wild about this gap is that it exists even when our intentions are incredibly strong and urgent action is absolutely required. For instance, studies show that people who urgently need to lose weight for serious medical reasons still frequently fall right into this gap. Think about that. If a literal medical emergency isn't enough to keep you on track, it clearly tells us that motivation alone just isn't a magic ingredient we think it is.
Okay, so let's dive into this. To understand how we actually bridge that gap, we've got to look at how a goal forms in our minds in the first place. And this brings us to something called the Rubicon model of action phases. Now, the name is fantastic. It comes from the epic historical tale of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon River. That river represented an absolute point of no return. Once he crossed it, his intentions were revealed, and he moved from just thinking about a military campaign to actually executing it. Well, psychologically speaking, every successful goal requires you to cross your own mental Rubicon. You have to shift from the motivational process of just deciding what to do to the volitional process of actually striving for it. The model breaks this journey down into 4 distinct phases. First up is the pre-decisional phase, where you're deliberating, kind of just weighing the feasibility of your wishes impartially. Second is the pre-actional phase. This is that crucial post-decision moment where you plan exactly how and when to execute. Third is the action phase, where you're actually doing the thing. And finally, the post-actional phase, where you look back and evaluate the outcome. The big takeaway here is that to succeed, your mindset has to actively shift. You literally have to leave behind that impartial, deliberative mindset and adopt a partial, highly optimistic, implemental mindset to tackle those execution phases. But of course, crossing that mental river is exactly where we run into the traps. And that brings us to the first major hurdle in our ADA discussion today, the trap of present bias. Let's say you've crossed the Rubicon, right? You've set the goal, but almost immediately you get derailed. Why does it happen? Well, because as humans, we have this deeply ingrained behavioral tendency to settle for a smaller present reward rather than waiting for a much larger future reward. We fundamentally overvalue immediate gratification, and we put way less worth on long-term consequences. In economics, this dynamic inconsistency is exactly why we fail to commit to saving plans. In health, it's why we skip diets or put off those medical checkups. We essentially suffer from short-term impatience. Now, the neuroscience behind that impatience, it is completely fascinating. According to McClure's dual system model, our brains literally process these choices in 2 entirely separate systems. If an immediate reward is sitting right there, impulsive, emotion, and reward processing areas like the ventral striatum just light up like a pinball machine. They are highly sensitive to getting something right now. On the flip side, future rewards, even if they're massive, fail to trigger our emotional centers in the same way. The prefrontal cortex is engaged for evaluating future consequences, sure, but it's very often overpowered, simply because our brains tend to drastically downgrade future benefits compared to whatever is staring us right in the face. To make matters even worse, we're constantly battling what educator and economist George Lowenstein calls visceral hot states. These are temporary physical or emotional states. We're talking hunger, thirst, strong emotions, fatigue, or pain that have a direct hedonic impact on us. Just think about walking into a coffee shop. You have a goal to lose weight, but suddenly you see that pastry counter. Boom! You are plunged into a hot state of intense hunger and craving. Those temporary emotions completely hijack your executive functioning. They force you to focus entirely on the present moment, completely ignoring that future, healthier version of yourself you were just aiming for. Which leads us directly into our next villain. Let's look at obstacle 2, the willpower drain. In the psychological literature, this is formally known as self-regulation failure. You see, even if you do manage to resist that pastry, the very act of resisting it actually costs you something. Self-regulation is the process of overriding an impulse or a habitual response, and doing that
It requires real biological energy.
The strength model of self-regulation illustrates this perfectly. Our capacity for self-regulation is actually a limited resource. Willpower is quite literally like a muscle. When you use a muscle to lift heavy weights over and over again, it becomes exhausted, right? Well, similarly, when your brain faces simultaneous demands to control your thoughts, your feelings, or your impulses, your self-regulatory strength simply gets depleted. So, what actively depletes this willpower muscle on a daily basis? Stress and anxiety are absolutely massive drains. Fatigue is another huge one. Data actually shows that diets are most often broken late in the evening when our self-regulatory capacity is just totally tired out from the day's decisions. Simultaneous life demands and even alcohol consumption drastically impair our ability to monitor ourselves. So the crucial point I want you to take away here is this. Goal failure is very often a human glitch in our executive functioning. It is not a moral failing. You aren't lazy. Your biological resource pool of effort has simply been drained by the sheer demands of daily life.
And you know what happens when that willpower drains? We often fall victim to something psychologists call the abstinence violation effect, or, as it's way more commonly known, the what the hell effect. Just imagine our dieter who has successfully avoided the pastry all week, but on Friday evening they're exhausted and they eat a single bite of chocolate. Instead of just saying, okay, a minor lapse, their brain catastrophizes. They think, what the hell? I've completely blown my diet, so I might as well eat the whole darn thing. A small, trivial lapse turns into a massive binge because the initial failure causes an emotional distress that further demolishes whatever tiny bit of self-control was left.
Okay, so we've mapped out the anatomy of failure. We know all about the intention-action gap, present bias, and the willpower drain. So, how do we bypass these traps? It's time to steer our ADA toward a very hopeful, scientifically proven resolution, the if-then solution. The clinical term for the strategy is implementation intentions, which has been researched heavily by Peter Gollwitzer. Remember how general goals fail because we lack in-the-moment motivation? Well, implementation intentions are concrete if-then plans. They connect a specific future situation, a cue, with a specific goal-directed behavior. In a really cool way, they act as a prosthesis for our executive functioning. Just like a mechanical limb helps someone walk, an if-then plan helps your brain act by literally outsourcing your willpower to your environment. Just think about the difference here. A generic goal intention is super abstract. I will exercise more. That requires you to wake up, figure out when to exercise, where to do it, and then somehow conjure up the motivation on the spot. But an implementation intention, it's highly procedural. If it is 5 p.m. on Tuesday, then I will go to the gym. By explicitly specifying the when, where, and how, you bridge the gap. You create a mental representation of 5 p.m. on Tuesday, so when that exact time arrives, your brain is already primed and ready to execute the behavior. So why does this one simple tweak work so remarkably well? Because it automatizes your behavior. It completely capitalizes on our brain's brilliant ability to run on autopilot. By deciding the specifics in advance, the behavior happens without conscious effort or agonizing deliberation. This frees up your precious, limited cognitive resources. But most importantly, it entirely removes the need to rely on motivation or willpower in the moment. When you hit a speed bump, or you find yourself staring down a visceral, hot state, your if-then plan shields you from distractions because the decision has already been made. It bypasses your depleted willpower and your present bias completely. Which brings us to the end of our explainer today. We've seen that relying on sheer will and motivation is pretty much a guaranteed recipe for frustration. So, I want to leave you with this final, provocative question. Will you rely on motivation tomorrow, or will you build an if-then plan today? Thank you so much for joining me in the Informative ADA. I really hope this structured look at the psychology of goals empowers you to stop fighting your biology and start outsmarting it. Take a quick moment right now to write down just one if-then plan for your biggest goal. Until next time, keep learning, keep planning, and take care.